see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here with Leah Green, and we're going to be talking about how we can build a culture of empathy and compassion together. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Edwin. It's great to be here with you, finally.
Yeah, finally, we've been talking about this for a long time, getting together, and so I'm really glad to have a chance to kind of talk to you on Skype and kind of explore this topic of empathy and compassion.
I'm a regular watcher of your videos.
Oh, good. Somebody watches. Great. That's encouraging. Well, I thought we would first, start with introducing you. And maybe I should say that I have a little bit of hay fever. So if anybody's seeing me sneeze or tear up, it's because of the hay fever. I thought we'd start with your Facebook page, and I have that here. And I can bring it up on the screen, and I'm seeing you kind of coming out from behind a green leaf. That seems to be your favorite picture. Can you say something about that?
Well, I've been spending time and most recently birthing some new projects in Guatemala, and I just love the affinity of being in the winter time where there's enormous green leaves that are way bigger than my face. So yeah, that's my personal Facebook page, and we also have the Compassionate Listening Project Facebook page, which you'll find by, I think it's just under Compassionate Listening.
.org. I have it here. I just brought it up on the screen.
Okay.
So it's actually showing on the screen, and you have like a series of photographs that are showing. It looks like from all different countries in Berlin and.
Okay, so now you're on our website, but I was trying to say that we have a Facebook page for Compassionate Listening.
Oh, okay. So you've got your personal web page, and I was just kind of wondering, is that photograph there, is that Guatemala too? There's a little town and beautiful hills and on your Facebook page?
The one with me with the big leaf?
Yeah, and behind it.
That's at Lake Atitlan, Guatemala, yes. And those are volcanoes.
Oh, it looks beautiful. Yeah. And so you're doing compassionate training at all these places, or what is it kind of? Maybe you could share a little bit of your background and what it is that you do.
Yeah, sure. Well, my first nonprofit the nonprofit that I founded grew out of a project, and at that time I was only working in the Middle East. It was called Mideast Citizen Diplomacy, and I was bringing primarily North Americans to Israel and Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, for deep immersion experiences. And it was the birth of compassionate listening was really an overlay. We adopted it as a framework for the work in the Middle East because we found it so difficult to get people to open up to the other and go beyond their very, very profoundly strong opinions about the war and the conflict in the Middle East. And so in bringing people down there, which I started in 1990, I really felt that if people had firsthand experience of the other and sort of, got to sit together and see that the people they thought were the enemy on the other side were really just like them. They didn't have horns and they weren't evil monsters. They had children just like they did and kissed them off to school in the morning. So it was really this idea of of citizen diplomacy work that at the time when I was going to college, was really making a difference, I think, in the thaw between Americans, U.S. people, and the former Soviet Union. And that mode of citizen diplomacy was really in its heyday. And I tried to adopt that to the Middle East and to bring people from primarily North America to Israel and Palestine. But what I experienced is that the same framework of citizen diplomacy did not work over there. And so I had to find a new framework. And the new framework that was overlaid on the delegations ended up to be this concept of compassionate listening. The idea really came from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk and peacemaker and poet and writer. And Thich Nhat Hanh challenged peacemakers to humanize people on all sides of a conflict and to not take sides. And he was really, I think it was pretty radical in the 80s, because I think a lot of the peace movement was oriented around having an us and a them and being on one side or another. And I think that these ideas, which he was espousing during the Vietnam War in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, they really, they ended up catching on, but it took a long time. And so when we adopted this in 1990 in the conflict in the Middle East, it was a pretty radical idea at that time, 22 years ago. And people were very resistant to it. So it was really hard, the idea of, okay, come to the most conflicted place on the planet, the longest protracted war in the planet, where people have very strong feelings about who's right and who's wrong, and practice this idea of encountering every human being and trying to find the spark of the divine in every human being. Try to open yourself to the place of compassion and go underneath what they're saying or what their political position is. And how do we even ask questions or be with people that we regard as the other or we regard as the enemy, and be able to get to this place of compassionate interaction and holding another person with compassion, not from a mental place of, oh, I should be holding this person with compassion, but a true inner transformation. And so we've been practicing, that's how I started, was practicing in a war zone, in a highly polarized conflict. And so we were practicing with a lot of curriculum that we could pretty instantaneously see what worked and what didn't work. And then maybe about 9 years later, after we started in the Middle East, we had a lot of people asking in the States, well, what is it that you're doing over there? And how come you're not doing it here, teaching us here? And so we realized we really could take the essence of the practices that we were using and bring our curriculum here to the United States. And so I started teaching in the States in 1990, but everything was birthed with our practices in the Middle East and bringing the people together and bringing North Americans. And so I didn't start in an ivory tower. I started in refugee camps and in offices of the PLO and with leaders and interfaith practitioners and common people and peacemakers, reconciliation workers, hardliners, settlers, extremists from both sides. We practiced with full range and learned how we could really bring people into that place of compassion. So I guess at this point it makes sense to tell you the lesson that we learned, or that magic spot that we learned from our practice in the field, was being able to hear the suffering, the personal suffering of the other, not somebody's standing on a soapbox and espousing their political ideas, but sharing their very, very personal life stories of maybe what happened to them when they were young, or how they were impacted by the war as a child. And once people started sharing their very personal life stories, them and their family and the impacts, that was the magic point. That was the turning point, where people's hearts opened up and said, wow, if I were that person, I might now have their same life outlook or political position or whatever, because now that I've walked in their shoes, everything else makes sense about them. And the judge fell away. And all it was sort of a joining of heart to heart, and often crying with a person, everybody crying together, shedding tears for just the tragedy of war and the senselessness that we're so, what war does, the human costs of war. So that's a little bit about how the Compassionate Listening Project began, and eventually it became such a powerful overlay with implications everywhere that we changed the name of the nonprofit from Mideast Citizen Diplomacy to the Compassionate Listening Project. And then all the work was filtered through our Compassionate Listening curriculum.
So it sounds like it really started by kind of putting yourself into situations and learning by doing. Just say, I'm just going to start someplace, and I'm just imagining you didn't have all the answers, but you just kind of started and kind of learned by doing.
We learned on the job.
Mm-hmm.
Every gathering with a new person over there was our classroom. And sometimes we failed, but sometimes we would start succeeding, and we'd say, what was that? What happened in that room that was that allowed us to have a successful experience and a transformation? And so we would analyze right in the moment, or right afterwards, what was that worked? Yes, so absolutely. Our curriculum was born in in our living classroom of this war zone and the high polarization.
Yeah. Well, what I'm hearing is that what you found is kind of like the gateway was the storytelling and the sharing of stories of pain and of personal pain and suffering. That was kind of the gem that kind of you kind of boiled it down to.
Yes, because when we can clear all that other stuff away, our political positions, our grandstanding, our blaming and judging and all that stuff, and just get down to the essence with another human being sharing with us their journey and their life suffering, it has this way, it has this effect of bringing everyone into their shoes. You can imagine, especially when the listener doesn't have to defend anymore isn't sitting there feeling like they're being blamed for all of the ills in the world, or all of the horrible experiences that this person has had. And when it's just a person telling their story with this happened to me, this is my journey, this is my heartbreak that I experienced, and all of a sudden we're in tears together. And then they can also see, wow, this person that I thought was my enemy can hear me and feel empathy for my journey and is now crying with me. Wow, that person I thought was the enemy is now my friend. And how is it that we can be in this room together, stripped down at the essence, and be humans together? And we were really redefining the meaning of what it meant to be human together, and blowing everybody's stereotype in the room. We were all having our stereotypes blown and getting to this core place of essence to essence relating. And it would often be very confusing and there was an effect of destabilization, because when you hold these viewpoints about another person and then everything changes, it's a little disorienting. And we would often walk out of circles just, wow, what just happened? Or the person, what just happened? My world just got a little topsy-turvy. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, talking about stories, do you have some stories of, from when you're starting in the 80s or so, where you actually, we have these high points, these peak moments where we experience like the power of empathy or the power of compassion. Do you have some of those stories where you kind of learn those lessons of, hey, this is pretty powerful stuff?
Yeah. I could fill books with myself. Maybe one day I will. Wow. Well, I remember one time I was taking a group deep into Hebron in the West Bank. I don't know if you personally have any associations with Hebron. It's one of the biggest Palestinian cities in the West Bank. And we were going to meet one of the founders of Hamas. Do you have any associations with Hamas? Hamas is largely perceived in the West as being a terrorist organization, and a radical hotbed of extremism. And we were on our way to actually the home of one of the founders of Hamas in Hebron. And so there was some fear, some trepidation. People were very worried. How am I going to find empathy for somebody who espouses terrorism, things like this? And we went into this beautiful living room that was filled with platters of fruit waiting for us. And we sat down with this man. He was like the equivalent of a Muslim priest, an imam, and he told us about his journey and about his inner journey of transformation, of being born, what it was like to be born into a cycle of vengeance and revenge. And that's all he knew was hit and be hit, vengeance and retaliation. And he talked about his own process of transformation that came from really being able to take time with the Quran his holy book, and to find passages in the Quran about reconciliation and love and forgiveness. And he recognized that if he didn't have a personal transformation, that this cycle that he was born into would never end, ever, ever, ever. And he talked about starting a jihad, which jihad means to effort or struggle for something. It literally means effort. And he talked about starting a jihad for peace and for reconciliation. And going into the mosques and preaching this idea, this radical concept, and starting to meet. He had already started to have meetings with rabbis and ministers who had the same kind of idea. And people asked him if he was afraid for his life, because here he was going into these huge mosques throughout the West Bank and preaching something very different, very radical. And he told us how he never had a bodyguard, and he was never afraid. And he went on radio on Fridays. His lectures, sermons were put on the radio and spread far and wide. And we said to him, somebody asked him, how do you, let me think of the question. It was, because he was dealing with people who still espouse
revenge and violence and
I can't even think of the word now. When things like suicide bombings and bus bombings, terrorism. And we said, well, how do you deal with your people who are still really wedded to this idea that terrorism is the way? And he said something to us so profound. He said, how do you deal with people whose hearts are filled with hatred? He said, you have to become their family. You have to love them and become their family. And I remember it just gave me chills at the time, sitting in a chair in his living room and hearing about his own process of transformation, because I felt like what he was doing in his own culture was just perfectly described this process that we had been engaging in by then for years. It just perfectly described our work in compassionate listening, that our mission really is to become the family of those who even hold hatred towards us. How do we do that? And there's a lot in there. There's a lifetime of work in there, or a pathway of work in there. How do we become the family to those who see us as the enemy, or to those we see as our enemy? So that was a very profound day. We've also been with imams who espouse terrorism, and then it became our job to just hold them with love and not try to talk people out of anything, because that just, goes back to the tug of war of who's right and who's wrong and what is the way. But we found that when we got into that kind of polarity, we had to become the way. We had to be compassion and allow people to have an experience of being held with that kind of love. And so we would often ask people at that point to tell us how the war affected them. And at that point, we would hear the stories of suffering. Often things like their father being pulled out of a house when they were 8 or 9 years old and shot in front of them. It's really easy to see how people take up extremism or take up terrorism as a way of life, because terror was what happened to them. And it's all they knew. And all they could see was a way of striking back to get revenge. But when we wind it back to, can you share what happened to you as a child? What did you see? What did you experience in this war? How did this war affect your family? And those stories come out. We're nothing but a room full of people crying with that person and imagining ourselves in their shoes. So that's what we had a lot of. And on both sides, you know, our mission was to hold people with empathy and with compassion.
So you're going into these conflict situations and saying everyone's part of my family, and I want to hold you all in kind of that embrace of family.
Right. And so at its essence, my mentor was a Quaker woman named Jean Knudsen Hoffman, who's passed on now, but she was an international peacemaker, and Thich Nhat Hanh was one of her teachers. But as a Quaker, the Quaker way of saying it is that there's a spark of the divine in every human being. And I think that in every spiritual tradition, there's something that says the same thing in the words of one's own tradition. And if we really take that to heart and we really act on that in the world, what it means is that we can go into the harshest places. And one of Jean's teachers was a Quaker mediator. And I remember him describing having to prepare for days to go in Serbia and talk to a warlord who was responsible for the deaths of many of his friends, many of his close personal friends. And that he had to prepare himself to hold that possibility of seeing the spark of the divine in this Serbian warlord. And you know, the meditation that it took, the personal preparation that it took for him to go and sit face to face with this person. And often in our trainings, people will say, well, you know, I understand what you're saying, but up to a point. Like Hitler, forget it. And this is, every individual, I think, has to find their own comfort zone of where it makes sense for them to work. For my teacher, Jean, she said, yes, even Hitler, who was deeply wounded as a child, that somewhere underneath all the wounds and all the hurt, there was still a spark of the divine within that human being. But every person has to find that place for themselves, and where it makes sense for them to work. If you've been deeply wounded, for example, if you were the victim of, say, sexual abuse, and you have not healed from that, in this lifetime, it does not make sense for you to go into prison and listen to convicted sexual offenders. That is a boundary for you that is absolutely needs to be respected. But every person has to define their own boundaries. But that is at the root of our teaching, is that every person at their core, at their center somewhere, their heart center is a whole human being that then life happened to, and life took in different directions. And when we are hurt, we protect that place and we adopt different strategies. So when I go into people in rough situations, I just prepare myself to see the spark of the divine in that person. And I've gone into some very difficult, very dangerous situations. It seems to be part of my karma in this lifetime. Work in war zones and post-war zones. And I think, Edwin, that one of my most dramatic stories has to do with my own challenge of, as a Jewish person who is from a family with people that were deeply affected in the Holocaust. And I was doing all this reconciliation work in the Middle East and bringing people together, but I had personally written off Jewish-German reconciliation as impossible. This was, in my 20s and 30s and into my early 40s. And it wasn't until I was about 40 years old and a Holocaust survivor from Jerusalem challenged me to go to Germany that it was time for to face my own demons. And I was scared to death. I was just scared to death. I did not want to do this work. I was afraid to face, whatever was waiting for me there about Jews and Germans. And that was the hardest work I ever did, was facing my own place of who's beyond the pale. I can reconcile, or people can reconcile with anybody, but Jews and Germans, forget it.
Well, what did you do for the preparation? Because I find that a very interesting way is how you prepare yourself. There's a process, restorative circle process that Dominic Barter does, and he has something that you have or you kind of talk with someone else and you pose the question of what will block me. Are you seeing any blocks to the humanity of all the people involved that you will be going to? So it'd be like if you were going to the German Jewish dialogue, it's like beforehand you have a little bit of empathic listening by someone else that sort of models the hearing what it is that kind of comes up and maybe might be a block to that sense of seeing the divine and to connecting. So I'm wondering what kind of ways have you found that kind of help kind of prepare yourself for that?
I think that is so important what you just said, and especially since the Germany project, what I have found and what led me now in these last 2-3 years to be trained as a constellation facilitator in systemic family constellations is that oftentimes we don't understand that what's holding us back is our family, feeling the allegiance and the loyalty to our family system. So, for example, coming to understand that I at some level, it felt like a transgression to all of my grandparents, all four of my grandparents who went through hell to get to the United States, and my grandfather who lost most of his siblings in the Holocaust and his extended family. And that beyond our knowing rational mind, we're part of our family system, and anything that happens in our family system affects the rest of the system, whether we know it or not. And so on some level, I felt that I was betraying the suffering that my grandparents had to endure, and that my whole extended family system at that generation had to endure, that to make peace with the enemy, that I would be somehow outcast from my family even. And so it was part of holding tight. And I think that it's why I ended up pursuing a lot of training in constellations these last few years, because I think I saw the limitations of personal work or working with what we think is going on individually. We're from such a culture of individuality, the me versus the collective, and how the collective impacts the individual. And so I really began to see the limitations. For example, my working with Israelis and Palestinian peace leaders for the last 10 plus years. Yes, there's individual work, and there's work that we have to do on ourselves, but each of us are part of collective systems of trauma and collective tribes and family systems that have undergone these wars or these collective experiences. And it's not just me, it's my whole it's my whole family that is holding tight to the fear and the loyalty and so I needed, in some way, I needed to face what happened, and I needed to face my fear of being really, in a way, betraying my family by reaching out to the other side. And I think in many ways they had to do the same thing. But it's a fascinating question that you asked. I know I had a lot of personal fear just standing in the airport in Hamburg. I remember standing in the airport waiting for the person who was meeting me. And I remember looking at every man over the age of 65 or 68 or something, and thinking to myself, you could have been a Nazi, you could have been a Nazi, you could have been a Nazi. And I had to go over to a pillar. I was shaking so hard. I had to stand against a pillar to just deal with my own level of fears. And I think that listening to each other's fears, there is an incredible power of doing the work together from the sides of the victims and the perpetrators, because what we found is that many of us had tried doing work before without the presence of the other side. And it was as if we needed the other side for the healing to happen, for the complete healing to happen. There was some magical component of having us all together.
You can't just kind of do it on your own, in your own kind of therapeutic kind of a way, that it's like that personal engagement. but it's kind of like how you prepare for that personal engagement. The process, with restorative circles, is it's not just asking yourself what will be the blocks to seeing the person's humanity, but having it heard by somebody else, so that there's sort of this preparation, there's this deepening of being heard, and it's almost like a trust building in the
Right.
essence of empathy and compassion. It's almost, I feel it sometimes, I use the metaphor of a reservoir, that needs to be filled, that we kind of get that empathy reservoir kind of filled, and with stresses and strains and being on our own, it kind of dries out a little bit, and you got to get filled in again. So going through such a difficult situation, it's like, did you do some kind of preparations like that? And then the other part is you're going towards that fear, and I can just feel being falling apart with trembling. It's like I've had that feeling, as well, where it's like I can't keep it together anymore. It's like so overwhelming. I'm totally going to become, obliterated or something. And to keep going in that it takes something to keep going towards that, to those fears.
We had a lot of really careful processes that we used. Some of them, I'm sure you would be familiar with all of them. But after we all had compassionate listening training for a couple of days, we actually separated. We did one of those things. We had 16 Jews and 16 Germans. And we separated for an entire morning, early afternoon, into our respective groups. And we went through the kinds of trainings that you do with the safety with each other. And where we could really say the things with full honesty that we were afraid of about the other side, or our prejudices about the other side, and really get a lot of that out and get heard and have empathy for those feelings that come from many different places. The programming, the prejudice, the what got said in our families or our synagogues about Germans, or just in society in general, and they in turn about us. And so we had time to get a lot of that out and cry and laugh with each other, and then come to some deeper processes that would lead us into being together and to be able to see the humanity in each other. And that was a profound day. I will never forget that day. I call it the Jewish-German wedding day. Because when we had just sort of emptied ourselves of all that stuff and of all the fears and all the hurt and all the prejudice, and we were able to come together in silence and just human to human with no words, and experience the love and the humanity in the person in front of you. It was like we all fell in love with each other. And it reminded me of when a bone is broken, and that it's said that when that bone heals, it's stronger than it was before at the place of that break. And when we went through those processes of reconciliation, we came back together as a family that was so strong. I never imagined this could have happened in a million years, but they were like family in such a way, because we knew each other's deepest break, the place of brokenheartedness about we can't heal from this. Humanity is just too broken. There are places of brokenness in the world that live inside of us and lived inside of our families that my grandparents could never heal from. Their grandparents and parents could never heal from. But we, the children and the grandchildren, came together, and it was like mending that sense of hopelessness and knowing that anything is possible, that no matter what people go through, the horrors of horrors, whether it's Serbia, whether it's Israel, Palestine, whether it's Nazis and the Holocaust, we have the capacity to come back together and love and trust and forge new places of strength and bonds that that nothing can sever. So we were like, we knew we needed each other. We were the two bones that had to come together. And I couldn't mend without that other side of the bone. So that experience was profound for me because I knew from that point on that whatever I was afraid of in my life, I could fear. I had a new sense of courage and power that no matter how difficult something seemed, oh, I can never talk with my ex-husband. Oh, we could never, I could never do that. Whatever it was, I could never reconcile with my father. Whatever the tape loop is in our own head of, I could never, fill in the blank. I knew that I could find the courage to face the darkest places in the world, in myself, in life. And it gave me such hope for humanity. That project gave me such hope for humanity. I feel like I owe a lot to the people that participated in that first project, that 32 of us that came together, without knowing what would come from it. We didn't know if we would leave brokenhearted. It was a grand 10-day experiment, and it succeeded beyond everyone's imagination. So that to me was my own personal minefield that I had to walk through, and I finally felt like I had to walk through it so that I wouldn't be a hypocrite. I can't invite others to participate in reconciliation if I'm not willing to face those dark places myself. And I know that I can only be a trustworthy teacher in the areas where I've had the courage to go myself. So I bowed deeply to Esther Golan in Jerusalem, a Holocaust survivor who told me it was my time to go to Germany.
Well, it sounds like, from that experience that you kind of ended with this sense of hope. And that sounds like it's a new source of energy for kind of building on. And is that kind of what you're saying? And kind of what was built out of that new hope?
Yeah. Well, I think it wasn't until after that I began working in a much deeper way with Israeli and Palestinian peace leaders, because even though they were hopeless, many of them were hopeless, I wasn't. And I think that was sort of what I was referring to, that if I hadn't have walked that journey for myself and saw the world was sort of born anew for me from that experience. And I could it allowed me to walk back into really broken places in the world and hold the post of hope. And deep in my heart, I absolutely believe that no conflict is impossible to solve, that no break is impossible to mend. And so I did my maybe my deepest work with Israelis and Palestinians after my own work with Jews and Germans, and also now beginning the very beginning stages of working in a post-war community in Guatemala, where they're living in a sort of Serbia-like situation where neighbors transgressed against neighbors, victims and perpetrators still live in the same little village. And in the last 15 years, 16 years since the end of the war, there's been no addressing of, there's been no processes whatsoever, not for trauma, not for reconciliation, not for even just listening, even just the healing power of listening, which we started last month, was inviting people just to tell the impact from the war, and people who had never shared what happened to their families during the war couldn't believe that just talking about it had a therapeutic effect. They weren't expecting that. So I think wherever I take this work now, whether it's between a broken relationship in a family or wherever it is, I feel like hopefulness walks with me at the core of my being, and I feel so I feel so dedicated that no matter what has happened, I believe if people have the intention and the time and a skilled container, that anything is possible, because I've seen it. I've seen reconciliation among some of the toughest situations in the world. And I see broken marriages all around me for way lighter transgressions, if you will. You know, if you really look into the heart of how people get disconnected from each other in family systems especially, and you go back to what was that point where your grandmother stopped talking to her sister? Does anyone know that story? Does anyone know what that's about? And when you hear those stories, and sometimes even in wars that break out between countries, and you hear the actual stories at the heart of these breaks, and sometimes they're actually kind of funny. Sometimes they're very tragic, but sometimes there's an element of, well, she brought the wrong birthday cake. She insulted her sister, or, whatever it was. It's wow, and they haven't talked in 50 years, and both sides of those families, it's like the McCoys and but when you really go into what's at the heart of broken relationships, it's really amazing sometimes the stories that you hear.
Well, what I was hearing really when you were just talking is you mentioned intention. So when I think about, building a culture of empathy and compassion, which is really just creating that environment that you're talking about where people are connecting more deeply and resolving problems, is I just wonder where that intention, that initial intention that's kind of the starting point for doing this. Is it that things get so bad and it's just like nothing's working anymore? I just got to try something else. I may as well try empathy and compassion, or is it that I see you know, what you're doing and how happy you are, and it's like, I want some of that too, or, you know, where are those intentions coming from?
Well, that's fascinating. One of the stories that I often told in the early days of my work in the Middle East is that the people who express the most willingness to meet the enemy and try out these newfangled processes and reconciliation work and these radical ideas that were coming in the 80s and 90s, many of them were the ones that had been the most deeply shattered. So the ones that were coming to these experiments and sitting in circle, and then you'd go around with the introductions, and they would say, well, my name is Suha, and I was arrested and deported from my family when I was a 23-year-old activist, and I was not allowed to see my children for 13 years, or I was imprisoned as a political prisoner and I was not allowed to see my children, or I was tortured, or I was sent to Jordan. And the ones that had suffered the most were the ones that came forward with this courage to say, I do not want this to be the world that my children and my grandchildren grow up in. So they had a sense of courage to try to change things. So sometimes I think that people have to experience enough discomfort to want a different reality. And people that are in war zones, I mean, yes, there's a lot that perpetuates people in war zones, and there's a lot of science on trauma and what happens when people get sort of an addiction to the adrenaline of trauma and re-traumatization and just repeat the cycles and the patterns. But there's also a turning point that can happen. And grief is a big turning point. If a person or a culture has not been allowed to grieve for what happened to them or what happened to their people, often they will keep choosing the trauma. So it's very important. Grief work is actually a very, very important modality and I'm talking about even for former partners, say former husbands and wives who have never been allowed. They've been angry for 20 years, but they've never grieved. We find we find this throughout the literature and throughout the experiences of people, that grief can be a real turning point into choosing another way, choosing other options that are given to you. So I can't remember your full question now, but
I think it was the intention. It's like there's so many. I'm sorry, as you're talking, it's like I'm starting to see more intentions that kind of spur one. And there was, I think, what you were kind of building on is that you're going, you're really kind of hitting deep pain, deep hopelessness, or whatever, and it's like, well, I got to do something different. Whatever I'm doing is not working.
right.
And then there's grief involved in that. And something that did come up to me is, for me, I think it's a bit more like, hey, this is so good. This feels so good. It's like, why wouldn't I want to do this? It's like my peak experience in life, or kind of empathic connection, which is kind of for me, the gateway to love and these deep feelings of resonance. And it's like, why wouldn't we want to do that?
Right.
It's like, so that seems like an intention. And some people I talk to, they say, well, it's, it's those nice feelings, it's the nice feelings of connecting. It just feels so good. And, So I'm just looking for what are those intentions, because if we want to build this whole culture and
Right.
promote, we have to kind of, we have to find that and kind of build on it and to engage people. It's like, why would my neighbor be interested in this? Why, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, for me, coming from a person who's worked with a lot of people in pain and suffering, yeah, there's a lot of incentive. If we offer a different way, if we come in and say, hey, you want to participate in this, there's a lot of willingness to try new things. People in wars actually are looking for ways out, and they're actually hoping that there is a way out deep down in there, but often there's nothing presented. They don't have access to ways out. So but there's also, I think it's also very important that we can't just jump from A to C, that there's a little bit of, I think there can be, oh, why don't we just all feel good? This other thing feels good. And we have the privilege, if we haven't been dramatically wounded in our life, there's a lot of privilege that comes with being able to engage in these beautiful practices, and we have a lot of choice. You're in the Bay Area, I'm up in the greater Seattle area. There's a lot to participate in, even almost daily. We have a lot of privilege and a lot of choice. But for people who have suffered a lot and may not see a way of jumping from A to C, I think that making room to hear somebody suffering. If I'm filled with anger or filled with whatever hard emotion it is, and I'm not heard, I'm going to be frustrated. That first step of just being heard, just allowing me to empty myself and to just be received. I think that's why you're setting up the tents, the empathy tents. I imagine you've heard a lot. I imagine you've listened to a lot of frustration, anger, a lot of difficult emotions. But I think that people really need to be heard, and it's important not to do kind of what I'd call a spiritual bypass, saying, oh, let's just go over here. It's so nice and beautiful.
Yeah, it's what you're saying is what I'm hearing, at least, is it's going to where people are. It's like, to build a culture of empathy and compassion, we start by going where people are and kind of build from that point then.
Exactly.
Yeah. From wherever they are. Yeah.
We train people to look for the people who are marginalized in their community or their family or wherever, because if we don't listen to those marginalized voices, they will become louder and louder until, if there's no access to being heard, they'll become terrorists. In the most extreme manifestation, it's saying, listen to me. I'm not being heard. And I'm going to get louder and louder, whether it's to my husband, to my, my child's going to yell, until I'm heard. And so really it's just looking for those people, those places in our world, in our family system, where people need to be heard and give them opportunities. And that's why we talked a little the other day over email. That's why my deepest belief is that if these practices, and there are many, many curriculums out there, I'm not proprietary. I say use them all, learn them all, choose what works for you, mix them all together, call it your own, whatever. We're in too late a stage to get tied up in the ego base of, oh, this is mine and that's yours. And I think that people need to just learn as much as they can, as much as they have access to, and practice what feels good for you. And that anybody that has access to education, these skill sets need to be embedded in our educational systems, wherever we can embed them, we have to prioritize them and embed them. So that's the major challenge that I see in our societies, in our world. How to
kind of the next step forward. Yeah,
compassion.
Kind of that training. You know, in doing these dialogues, I've started off usually asking about metaphors, and I did kind of mention that, and I would feel remiss if I didn't hear your metaphor. I would feel incomplete. Because I've been finding it's kind of like fun to frame the dialogue around metaphor because it kind of has a pictorial quality to it. So I was wondering what you had come up with for your metaphor for empathy or compassion. What is it like?
Well, it's not mine. It's my mentor's, Jean's. But Jean Knutson Hoffman, she came back from our first delegation in 1996, where we adopted compassionate listening as a framework. And she wrote an essay about our delegation, and she titled the essay, "An Enemy is One Whose Story We Have Not Heard." And is that a metaphor, Edwin?
Yeah, you could work it, or it could work it around, I suppose. It's a it would be pictorial. It's like empathy and compassion is like not hearing someone's story. Yeah, I guess that would.
Well, the opposite. Yeah.
Or hearing someone's story. Yeah, hearing their story is the experience, and I guess the opposite is not hearing their story.
Right. So in our case, it's listening with the heart. It's one of our most important in our compassionate listening practice. We have what we call 5 core practices, and listening with the heart. So I can listen to you from my head, which keeps me in a mode of separation, because the head is more about thinking and judging and duality.
Perspective taking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I can shift my focus down here and anchor in my heart, which that's what our practice builds around, is how to anchor in our heart, especially in the really challenging times, so that I'm listening to you from my heart. And when I listen to you from my heart, it's really impossible for you to stay my enemy. Because all of those things, all the things that we know from the universities, from heart math, and all the research that has been coming out for well over a decade now about the role of the heart and what the heart does, the waves that it brings us into this synchronistic place where we feel more unity with one another. I mean, all you have to do is peruse your website to find all the beautiful science that is now documented what happens when we anchor in our heart. But that's the magic of why it works. So it's I think it really, in our experience, it really is quite difficult to stay separate or to maintain an enemy identification when I'm listening to somebody from my heart.
So with in terms of creating a culture of empathy, we're wanting everyone to be able to hear from the stories from each other's hearts. And with the compassionate listening, you've created a curriculum of steps and ways to kind of help facilitate that. And there's a lot of ways out there, and it's like we need to start kind of getting together. That's one thing I'm trying to do with this, is start networking with the people who are kind of have this value of empathy and compassion, I mean, there's already plenty of networks out there, but keep strengthening and building that network so we can create more of a vision and all, more of a systematic curriculum of all the options, and see how we can keep building this and incorporate it more. Because you had talked about bringing it into the home. The parents need to learn these skills before having children. That we need to be having this in the schools, and all kinds of places to training. I mean, that was something you'd mentioned previously, that the learning and the training part is kind of critical.
Yes, and we put almost all of our 2-day introductory workshop into a book called The Art of Practicing the Art of Compassionate Listening, which you'll find on our Compassionate Listening website under Books and Videos.
I'm bringing it up on the website here. It's with Andrea Cohen, yourself, and Susan Partnow.
Yes.
And that kind of gives an overview of your process.
Yes, it's really, I mean, if you're a facilitator, you can use the exercises right out of the book. There's, if you've been through our training, it will remind you of what those were so that you can facilitate the practices yourself or continue working them yourself. And if you're a facilitator of other work, you can maybe get some new ideas to roll it in with your own work. But we were really, when we first started teaching, a lot of our facilitators had studied with Joanna Macy, and we loved the way that Joanna Macy put a lot of her curriculum out in a book called Coming Back to Life with one of her co-trainers, and gave it away, to the world. This is our facilitation. These are our practices that we've been using. Here they are, Molly Young Brown and Joanna Macy. So we tried to do the same with this book. We didn't, we just wanted the people that write to us from New Zealand or from South Africa or wherever, saying, I can't get to one of your trainings, how can I take a training? And so we just tried to put our practices, our core practices, into a little book and make it accessible to people.
Well, this is really delightful. I just enjoy being in your presence. I mean, just being present with you is just a delight, and it feels very, I don't know, it feels very relaxing, very, just a real nice to be here with you. So,
well, that must
it's
be
just
something about your quality of presence.
Maybe. So I hope we can kind of keep these kind of dialogues going, and we've covered quite a bit, and I think it's an ongoing quest to build this, and for me it's going to be a lifelong quest, and it's great to have a connection with others like yourself, and along on this quest. And I'm sure there's a lot of other things you have to share that I'd love to talk about, and maybe get some panels and discussions. So just to keep the dialogue going and keep this sense of presence going as well.
And I love it that this is your focus, and you've galvanized so much energy and connection and your own dedication to put this front and center and just say, this is important. We have to be focusing on this. And it's too important to, brush it to the sidelines. How many videos do you have up by now?
Of interviews, it's going on 50, 60 interviews of people who are I mean, direct 1 hour interviews like this, just with empathy, people who are really focused on empathy and compassion. So it's surprising how many people there are. It's like the more I kind of look into it, they keep popping up. And so I think hearing all those stories, and then especially trying to get us together to start dialoguing, is something. There's some people told me when I asked about how do we build a culture of empathy, they said just start a dialogue about it. Just start talking about it, and keep it up. So this is kind of one kind of strategy here.
Absolutely. I think compassion and empathy are having a big comeback. For so long they were just sort of relegated to the realm of religion or spirituality. And I think that science has helped bring it back to the front and center and helped us to remember what we all
knew. It's just, my mother used to say, joys shared or joys doubled, sorrows shared or sorrows halved, right? And she has like a sixth year education, sixth grade education. So now the people with the scientists with their PhDs are saying, well, with mirror neurons, you connect with someone, oxytocin goes up and your pain level goes down, and there you go. Now her, not the wives' tales, but those phrases and terms that social, folks' tales and stuff. You see that they've been around all the time. So, but now we have the science, I think, and that can help us move this into front and center in society, is what I'm hoping.
And I think it is, with all the TED Talks and all the fabulous, really accessible scientists and materials out there. But my hope also is that very soon we will not need the scientists to validate that which we already know, and what I call the indigenous wisdom that is alive and well in the heart and soul of every one of us, knows these things at some deep core level, and they're alive in our own traditions that come from way, way back in our ancestral lines, when at one time in each of our ancestral fields we practiced this indigenous wisdom. For some of us, it's still going on, and some of it was cut way, way back. But so my hope is that the time is really, I thank science, and I say, please, soon, very soon, and hopefully now, we will start the process of also not needing science to remember and to know what we all already know.
Yeah, just experience it and be like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, great. We've gone on for an hour and a half almost. So
wow.
Then we'll continue to be continued.
Thank you, Edwin.
Thank you so much, Leah, for being part of this.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.